Thanks everyone for coming. I will imagine a few people will trickle in the next couple minutes, but I thought we could get started. My name is Michael Polson. I'm the director of the Cannabis Research Center at UC Berkeley, and I'm really excited for today's conversation. Before I get to that, just a reminder that the Cannabis Research Center is a center for interdisciplinary scholars to research the social and environmental dimensions of cannabis agriculture and production. We engage with growers, with local communities, with tribes, with government agencies to bolster public dialogue, inform policies and programs, and to support prosperous communities within a healthy environment. I was, uh, well, there's been a long debate in California about local permitting and local programs around cannabis. As many of you know, California is a dual licensing program, which requires both state licensing as well as local permitting to work in tandem in order for cannabis cultivation to proceed. And there's been a lot of different formations of how that then looks at local levels as it integrates or not with state rules. So at the Cannabis Research Center, we've done a fair amount of research on these local policies and this kind of checkerboard kind of format of how regulations have been rolled out in California. We've done a lot of research into local permitting programs as well as into counties that also implement ban policies. So I was really excited when Maggie, who I'll be introducing in a second, emailed me from the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance and had a video that they had produced with the California Resource Conservation Districts, which is also here today, and was putting forward a video to help folks think through the issues at stake in local regulations. In talking with them, we figured out that it would actually be good to be in conversation with some of the folks also at RCRC, who we'll also be introducing in a moment. And I think the composition of this panel I'm really excited for, as it represents a lot of different stakeholders in this evolving kind of policy landscape around cannabis. So moderating today is going to be my colleague, Dr. Margiana Petersen-Rockney, and she and I have done several years of research actually on counties that have banned cannabis cultivation. So I thought Dr. Petersen-Rockney was especially qualified to help moderate this panel and facilitate a conversation. So today, as far as the agenda goes, we'll be watching the video together and then having a panel discussion with a few kind of guided questions and a bit of a round robin. And then we'll be taking questions from the audience and any attendees. And then finally, we'll be closing with just a few words at the end about some upcoming events. As far as logistics go, there are a few buttons to be aware of. This is in a meeting format, so people are able to unmute themselves when the Q&A section comes up and ask their questions aloud. Or anytime the question kind of comes to you, you can just click the chat button and insert a question there. I believe you can also have reactions as we go along, and I think that includes raising your hand in case you do want to ask an audio question and want to insert yourself. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Petersen-Rockney.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for being here, and especially our panelists. I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves in a little more depth after we watch this short video. But just so you all know who's here, we have Maggie Phillipsborn from the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance, Nancy Wahl-Scheurich from the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, and Sarah Dukett from the Rural County Representatives of California. And as Michael mentioned, I'm Margiana Petersen-Rockney, and I'm a research affiliate at the Berkeley Cannabis Research Center and have been working on research regarding cannabis cultivation in California since about 2018. So without further ado, why don't we watch the video and then we'll dive into discussion. I think the sound isn't on there. Sorry, there's always, of course, going to be some technical difficulty with trying to play a video over Zoom, but we will get this sorted out quickly. And it was working when we tested it just a few minutes ago.
And I realize it might be because I'm on mute, so
Oh, yeah.
let's try that again. Thanks everyone for your patience.
The item on the agenda today is regarding restrictions on marijuana cultivation.
If you grew up in this community, you knew that cannabis, marijuana, pot, whatever you want to call it, was something that happened in Nevada County.
Cannabis has always been in Nevada County. Growing up, I felt it was taboo.
It became, in my opinion, quite overwhelming as far as the amount of cannabis that was growing.
We thought we were putting something in place that would help resolve the complaints that were coming forward. When in fact, since that time, our complaints have gone up.
It was about not caring for the land. That probably affected me more than anything, the destruction that was going on.
Game wardens commonly investigate complaints of people at marijuana sites poisoning and polluting water, killing wildlife, and destroying the environment.
The other thing was, we were not succeeding in any way in eliminating the grows.
Nothing has changed with our current ordinance and the outdoor marijuana grows. They just continue getting bigger.
And when that happened, and along with Proposition 64, I think we all began to, at least in my mind, rethink it. We actually hired a firm to come in and work with our county staff as well as the public. It was meant for that group to come up with a starting point for legal permitting cannabis grows in our county.
My name is Chris Hennis. My brother and I are family owners of Rock Creek Ranch. Rock Creek Ranch is in Nevada County. We're a couple miles north of Nevada City in the Rock Creek Canyon in the Yuba River watershed. We have a long history of family in agriculture. My parents farmed 600 acres of alfalfa. This is ideal territory for growing cannabis. We have a beautiful south-facing slope, and Nevada County is known for growing some great strains of cannabis.
You know, in my lifetime growing up on a farm, I mean, we're small. We run about 200 head of cattle, right? You got to grow that quality product. You got to put the love into it because every dollar has to count. So cannabis is similar.
I would say growing cannabis, biodiversity is important for maintaining a whole healthy environment. We have a local beekeeper. He keeps the bees here for us. We grow pasture that the natural animals like to eat. We work with a neighbor farmer who brings goats in and clears all the undergrowth. In our cannabis farming, we use mulch and compost and a lot of things to help preserve the water and conserve water. All the farmers in this community are working together to produce the best product. You know, we should have all the same benefits that other farmers have.
The standards that cannabis growers are held to are very high. It's a lot of testing, a lot of zero tolerances, parts per billion being tested, where traditional agriculture or even organic agriculture doesn't have that threshold or that standard that they have to meet.
In a regulated county like Nevada County, I have a lot more tools available to help me be successful with my job because we have an actual relationship built up with the county, within code compliance, within the sheriff's department. There's actually a working relationship, there's collaboration, and there's personal relationships that develop, which means that in the permitting side, we are all able to be on the same page and focus on problems and come up with solutions together.
And I always say to the persons that in a neighborhood that's worried about it, you know, if you have illegal grows going on right now, you're going to have those troubles if they're permitted. If there's a problem, we can come out, we can talk to them. And you know what? If they're not going to comply, we pull the permit. So they tend to comply.
I'm responsible for 17 different counties in the state right now. All the counties still run into the problem with unregulated cannabis. And on the enforcement side, in a county that allows regulated cannabis, we have a lot more resources and there's sharing of information. And so by having that teamwork, having the collaboration, having those relationships in place, we're able to actually achieve superior results than if we were to be there by ourselves.
If we were to include cannabis in our traditional crop reports, cannabis would account for about 0.5% of the production acreage in Nevada County and about a third gross value of Nevada County agriculture.
6 years ago, I would have probably said, you're crazy if you think I'm going to support cannabis. And now I'm looking forward to ribbon cuttings and welcoming new folks into this business that really want to do it the right way.
The farmers here in Nevada County, they're great stewards of their property. They love what they're doing. They want to put out the best product that they can. They want to grow the best product. All counties should be regulating it and controlling it for the betterment of everybody, for the entire state.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know that video didn't play like perfectly well over Zoom, but we'll make sure to share the link. It's really a wonderful video that has nice music and is very well produced. So apologies for those technical challenges, but now we can dive into discussion. And I'd like to start just by asking each of the panelists to take a minute or two and just share a little bit more about your work and how you came to be involved with this project and with cannabis regulation in California. And maybe, Sarah, would you mind starting since you're first on my screen?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So my intro into cannabis policy came when I moved up to Mendocino County. I was in the executive office. We worked regionally on policy we'd like to see pre-64, and we were talking about legalizing medical cannabis into a regulated format. From there, work to help get some programs off the ground. It was incredibly challenging, especially with cultivation, with areas of the state that aren't flat, have other type of environmentally sensitive issues within those communities. From there, I am with Rural County Representatives of California, and I work on their cannabis portfolio. We have 40 rural counties. Many of our counties allow cannabis cultivation or some form of cannabis activity, whether it be a distribution, retail, those types of things. We have some of we have all of the Emerald Triangle, and we have other areas of the state that produce a lot of cannabis, like Santa Barbara and Monterey, Yolo, etc. And as my not RCRC hat, I also serve as a planning commissioner for the County of Yolo, where we deal with regulatory issues around cannabis.
Thank you. Maggie, would you like to share next?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. My name's Maggie Phillipsborn. My entry into cannabis regulatory work was with the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance, probably back in 2017, 2018. The Alliance is a small nonprofit trade association. Diana Gamzon is the executive director, and I have worked for many years on local Nevada County policy work, as well as on a state level. And we have had a wonderful opportunity with the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts to make this film, which I think was shown in the chat, and I encourage everybody to try to rewatch it. And we've been talking, we travel around the state really talking to people about what we've done here in Nevada County policy-wise, and how to hopefully make the whole state system better.
Thank you. Nancy, can you share?
Sure. Can you hear me? Great. I am the executive director of the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, and we represent the approximately 90 resource conservation districts who are located across the state. And I'm just going to do a quick reminder of what RCDs, or that's our short name for them, are. So RCDs are special districts. They are state agencies, but 100% non-regulatory. And they were created by the state to work with landowners and land managers. So farmers, ranchers, foresters, parks, communities, anywhere where there's our land where natural resources can be protected. And to work with these land managers on a voluntary basis to get conservation work done. And they are really their unique value is that they live where they work, and they have really close ties, and they're very trusted in their communities and can meet these land managers where they are, whether, for instance, whether or not they believe in climate change, they can still work with them to find a way to recognize that healthy soils will make their crops better. And here's the kind of work that you can do to create healthy soils. So they're in a really great position to assist regulated cannabis farmers to employ best practices. And so that's why CRCD was approached by the Resources Legacy Fund back around when Prop 64 was passed, because they had great interest in harnessing the RCD connection with farmers to promote best management practices to protect our watersheds. That's really what they were all about. So that's how we got into the space. And then we eventually were introduced to Maggie and Diana from the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance, so that we could take their expertise and their great experience in Nevada County and combine that so that we could help promote across the state to certain RCDs where the boards were very reticent about supporting cannabis because, they just saw it as evil, to try to open those folks up so that we could get more RCDs taking advantage of the funding that CDFW and other agencies were providing to support their support of farmers who would like to be better stewards of the land. So that's how we got into it.
Great. Thank you so much. I think what I'll do next is I actually have a follow-up question for each of you. And then I have some questions to sort of open up the conversation and talk about the sort of decisions and consequences of localities permitting or not cannabis cultivation. But just starting off, I'm going to kind of work backwards, starting with you, Nancy. Could you just speak a little bit more to the ways that RCDs actually work with cannabis cultivators and why that support has fallen to RCDs?
Yes, and I would like to say up front that we have about 8 RCDs that have done active work with farmers. That's not enough given how many we have. But of course, there are many counties that, still don't allow regulated cannabis. And then we have this other problem, which we're trying to solve about those that are still afraid to have their folks involved. But one of the things that was funded early on by the Resource Legacy Fund through CRCD was the development of a program called Grass C, and this was basically guidelines that RCDs could use to help cannabis farmers start deploying the best practices that had been established that would get them just about to the point where they would qualify for licensing. So dealing with water, dealing with all the other issues that come up for licensing, and then enhancing that by helping them understand how they could add, for instance, pollinator habitat on their farms, and just really turn them into showcases of beautiful farming best practices. So that's the best, that's the most exciting way that they work with farmers. And of course, we do have RCDs who've also gotten to work in cleanups from illegal grows. But so the Grass C has been sort of a tool that they can use to get in the door to talk to these farmers. What we've been trying to do with CDFW, and we're getting close, is to also use them to help bring in funding for the farmers, because as we know, there are very few farmers in this industry right now who are rolling in dough. So RCDs play a really vital role in being that bridge between agencies who have funding and farmers. So the RCD, for instance, could go in and provide technical assistance, create a plan, help the farmers understand what needs to get done, and then pull in funding from, for instance, CDFW to help them. And then actually, if they need help, boots on the ground, helping to implement those practices, they could do that. Did that answer the question?
Yes, it did. And I think that maybe one thing I'll just add from, my own work is that, farmers who are growing this particular crop are in obviously a very unique position where a lot of the typical farm service providers who might help with some of those things, like providing technical and financial assistance to implement best practices like cooperative extension or USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, don't have access to those sources, those public farm service providers, because of their federal funding. So I do think RCDs have played a really crucial role when these other institutions, that these other institutions can't because of where their funding comes from.
Absolutely, 100%. Because normally NRCS would be the first stop for any normal farmer. They would have that access.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing a little bit more about how RCDs are working with farmers. Maggie, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned taking this video and traveling around, talking to, county governments and other people in other places. And I'm curious what the reception has been and how those conversations have gone.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And I think overall the conversations have gone really well. I have been pleasantly surprised actually with the reception of it. RCDs obviously don't have the same, they're not making policy decisions. They're not the ones in a specific jurisdiction who would make that sort of impact in terms of changing their minds. But like a lot of these rural communities, the RCD board members are very active members of the communities. They talk to people who are on city council and the supervisors, the county level, and things are changing. I think that the impact of just like the mindset of people, there was a resistance. There are some people who are just very resistant to cannabis as a whole, the plant, in any aspect of it. And there's other people who I think that's sort of starting to sort of fade away. But on a regulatory angle, it's really complicated. And I think people find that in and of itself sort of off-putting, like something they just really don't want to engage with, something that's so complicated for the jurisdictions that haven't regulated it. And the industry's in such a not positive sort of financial state and just functionality state at the moment that it's also hard to continue to show people sort of the plus of it, especially in regulating cultivation. There are more jurisdictions, I think, that are seeing or maybe looking into regulating retail. But there's a lot of cultivation happening already. But I think to the point of, communities that the jurisdictions haven't licensed already, it certainly is an interesting conversation for the areas that have large impacts from illicit cultivation. Because, one of the things that we've seen in Nevada County and that the film shows is really the impact of the positive impacts of and by regulating, we mean like creating an ordinance that exists in the jurisdiction that has a pathway, or that could be stringent or not, but just having an ordinance in place that's not a ban creates a lot more opportunities for conversation, for projects for RCDs to get involved with, and just really a lot of community benefit to that.
Great, and we are going to talk more about that. I have some questions about that, and some of the positives and negatives that counties that ban are missing out of permitting programs in a bit. But I do want to follow up, Sarah, with a question for you based on your comments and kind of building off of this conversation with Maggie. But just, how you've seen within the rural county representatives of California. I mean, you're interacting with a lot of different rural county governments, and how you've seen the sort of maybe stigma or kind of ideas that Maggie was talking about kind of changing over time, if you've seen those changing within, within those groups. And what kinds of concerns around permitting are you hearing now from localities who are maybe considering it, haven't done it yet, but might be considering it?
Yeah, I think the way people approach and think about cannabis is different than it was early on. The beginning days, it was, okay, let's see how the counties that decide to go first, how that works out. A lot of them had legacy cultivators, and they were in places that was easy to hide. And I'll tell you, that is the most complicated place to actually regulate them. When I just compare my time in Mendocino and Yolo, wow, flat land that is zoned to ag, it goes so much quicker, and the process is so much simpler. And also, this has a different environmental standard that you see in traditional agriculture. So a lot of them had to make the decision, what's best for the county? What process do we need to go through to make sure we don't get sued? Because litigation is a huge piece of that, and something that we can move forward. So we've seen a couple different models. I think everyone was really scared at first. I do think that has changed, and we've seen some counties move along, but there's a couple components with that. I think one, there has to be a want from your community, and there has to be resources from the county to pull it off. You're probably going to have to do an EIR. You're probably going to have a land use based permitting system, and that's going to could be a hefty process to get through. The ones that I think are the most complicated are those that have a lot of different geographical challenges and different types of landscapes, whether you're talking about rangeland, coastal zone, forests, which make things a lot more complicated, and those sites may or may not be able to be permitted long-term. Just depends. I will say I would say the North State, why I don't think the stigma is the same, and some of them have moved forward with things like retail. I really don't know if there's really an appetite to actually ever get there in cultivation, just with those communities, what their agricultural production looks like. A lot of it's cattle, the low population. And frankly, in county government, we're dealing with a huge vacancy rate with employees, particularly in planners. And you really need to have that to be able to pull this off. So you need the community wanting it, then you need the staff to do it. And they typically don't have discretionary revenues to hire consultants. But where I think you see some changes in movement is in like the Central Valley and other areas that sees this as a potential agricultural product. And we've seen movement in some of those counties, and some of them have grown. And that may change. Like Monterey, not too long ago, was one of their top 5 crops, no longer top 5 crops. The market has been struggling, and some areas chase the commodity. It's going to look different who's in the 1, 2, 3 spot. I do think that federal component makes it hard for some of the counties that have a lot of traditional agriculture that may be interested in joining in the cannabis industry, but because of their links to USDA or different types of loan and funding, that's not possible. And also, the money's not there. I think whether you can make a good profit off of that crop matters. And as long as there's those federal challenges, it's going to, I think, be really, really hard for cultivators in California to grow their business. Our market is only so big, and some might say we're producing too much. And so really we could be the breadbasket for the nation if those things change. That's been one of the priorities our CRC has worked on, is really around interstate commerce. And is there a possibility to do packs and find ways to move the product with other legalized state without federal intervention in that process, and working on a way for banking and things like that to hopefully lay the path long term. So when those things do change at the federal level, our folks have a fighting chance. So I do think I don't expect a lot more growth in the near future, just given the market's not in a great place and there's still those federal borders. But I think we've seen a lot of counties come on board with cultivation just in the last 4 or 5 years. And I do think there's still a lot of room for retail. And I do think that retail expansion is a key part, so that there's a market for the existing cultivators to sell their product. And it also doesn't help with the complication of hemp. And I think that's the new challenge really on the horizon, is the conflict between hemp and cannabis and the unregulated intoxicating hemp that's entering the market.
Yeah, thank you. You raised, many points there. I think we'll touch on some of them as we continue the conversation. So now I have a few questions for whoever wants to answer. If you each want to offer some thoughts, but you don't need to. But one question I have is kind of just stepping back. Proposition 64 created so many experiments with each county and each city getting to approach this crop in a different way. And I'm just curious, from your own work, obviously we heard a little bit about what's happening in Nevada County, but what sort of approaches are really working in terms of producing good environmental outcomes, good social outcomes, from all of these different experiments across the state in various ways to not only regulate, but also enforce around cannabis cultivation?
I mean, I guess I can start us off, and I think what works is massive amounts of education in every aspect of this. I mean, one of the main things that we've done, that Diane and I have done at the Alliance over the years, is education, from the licensing processes to, educating people on the policies and regulations, to educating people on best practices, but also educating people on small business skills, educating regulators, and really anybody who's touching any aspect of the industry. There's just so much education that still needs to happen, to really put all these pieces together. The supply chain is very fragmented, and so even getting people who work with different different types of businesses to understand the other businesses and how they all work together. It's just, education is just really what sticks out to me on what's been successful and how to make things successful going forward.
I think California chose a path that is a highly regulated industry, and probably too regulated. It's a lot of hurdles and a lot of money. So I think it's going to be incredibly hard for small businesses and small operators to survive. You need a lot of capital, which is not easy to come by given the federal prohibition. And at least on cultivation, a new environmental standard. So I think it does take a lot of education at the local level. I think it takes localities and to want to do it. to be a part of their economy, and it's going to be a bit of a lift. I think once you get past it and you get through your environmental review and you get your land use permitting going, it will be easier. I think a lot of the conversations in Sacramento is what can we do to like keep the industry going? Because we've seen a lot of people drop out over the last few years, and there isn't those traditional resources that you can go to CDFA or USDA and get. And I do think as we had consolidation and as we start talking about this in the legislature, there is room to really explore a lot more streamlining and ways that we can get people into the legal sector permitted a lot quicker and for a lower cost. And I do think we have to address the illicit cannabis. In my opinion, it is worse today than it was before 64, and it's only going to get worse. And we've had this mentality, particularly in California policy, is let's only reward the good actors that say yes to cannabis. And I say, hey, illegal cannabis anywhere is bad for all legal cannabis everywhere. And especially communities that have been bombarded with this, why should they trust to move into a legal environment, given that all of their other neighbors, it didn't make a difference? It's great for their economy and people that want to do this, but it doesn't necessarily mean illegal cannabis is going to go away. And it's been fragmented of how that enforcement looks like. It's been mostly CDFW, where DCC handles the other components. Frankly, if you don't have local jurisdictions that have money or resources, that's really who's doing the work on the ground. And it's been a mix of code enforcement and law enforcement. So I do think you have to like lower the barrier to entry, streamline the licensing, deal with the illicit, and lobby at the federal level. And we still got a long way to go. But the hope is to have a sustainable market that actually, can survive. And it's incredibly hard right now. And I will just briefly mention, we don't really have a tax system that I think works. And I think that's the next thing that will be overhauled.
I'm so glad to hear this from you, Sarah, and that RCRC is on all of those points. That's very encouraging. And I agree with all of those things that I also hope change and need to change.
I have nothing to add to these. I actually learned so much from what you just said, Sarah, also. So thank you. That was great.
Yeah, well, I want to maybe pick up on that point you mentioned, Sarah, about the sort of illicit cultivation. I think you said something like, it's even worse now than it was. And I think that this is a little bit of a two-part question, but in this experiment of, leaving, regulation of cannabis cultivation up to localities, this sort of like local control approach, we've of course created this patchwork geography where farmers growing the same crop are treated really differently in ban and permit counties. So one part of this question is, what has been missed in those banned counties? Like what are the tools, what are the impacts on things like funding, environmental stewardship, et cetera, when there isn't a pathway to, the licensed cannabis market for cultivators? And I guess maybe I'll just start there and then I can share the next part of this question. But yeah, if somebody wants to just speak a little bit about what you have seen. I can also share from our own research, but just sort of like highlighting maybe what's missed or what some of the differences are.
You know what? I don't know if the pathways matter that much for some of the egregious stuff, because there are pathways like in Humboldt, but they still have tens of thousands. So I think there are those that want to do this as a business and are farmers. But even before legalization, there were those operating in the prior structure and those that were far from it. With legalization, you really had a change of how you prosecute illegal cannabis with a misdemeanor. So you shift how you enforce. So we always put it in 3 buckets. You have you're supposed to be growing your personal, you grow a little bit more. Code enforcement says, hey, you're only supposed to have 12 plants. Then you have those that have gotten really good about buying cheap property. They grow a lot of cannabis. They grow as much as they can until they get busted, and they make sure they don't violate any environmental laws. and we usually deal with them in code enforcement. Then we have the egregious stuff. And I think the egregious stuff that's getting worse. And I don't believe any of them have any intention to get in the legal market. I mean, we're still having cartels, sex trafficking, you name it. And that stuff was happening pre-64. And I think that's kind of what has gotten worse and where the bulk of the sheriff, CDFW enforcement's going. And then we've been really looking at how do we bolster code enforcement, because that's what we're using now, because we don't want to send people to jail for lower level crimes, and really adjusting those mechanisms, because they were never meant to deal with this kind of stuff, to tackle those issues. And those are what typically the community impact issues you're doing in an area where there's people. I think that a pathway makes sense in certain places, but you also have communities that are really rustic, who were traditionally the type of cultivation we're talking about happen on public lands. And a lot of them will be over 70% public lands. And really, it wouldn't even be possible to have a really large, robust permitting structure, or given their other environmental concerns like water availability, really wouldn't. And I think that's still where a lot of the really bad, egregious stuff is happening, is like in the North State, in the hills. It's not in like San Joaquin on a big flat property, right? And I think where the growth opportunities for cannabis is in the communities and counties where it makes sense, because it really is a crop, right? What's the difference between cannabis and hemp? And where it's appropriate for it to be grown. And that also makes it easier for the jurisdictions. Like there's some jurisdictions you could spend millions of dollars and maybe you have enough to have like 20 licensees, because 75% of your land is public and most of it is mountainous and hilly. So I think pathways are important for illicit cannabis, but where the worst of it is, I don't really think that's a viable option for legal cannabis.
I'm sort of curious, Margiana, your thoughts just from your research on all of that. I don't disagree with you. I do think that I'll just, I guess, share from my experience. Nevada, we are surrounded in Nevada County by counties that do not have bans essentially on commercial cultivation. And I don't think that bans, I agree with everything that Sarah said. And I also just want to add to that I don't think bans are the way. Like, I think that just like prohibition in any fashion is not successful at achieving its goals. And I don't think and I think that for Nevada County, some of the benefits of having an ordinance in place, outside of just that creating the potential for a local legal industry, it's provided funding opportunities both to the county as well as to local nonprofits. There have been a lot of, like, on a hyper local level, a lot of economic benefits that wouldn't have been, some of like the Prop 64 grants, the DCC grants, which some of which I don't think are an option for jurisdictions unless they have a ordinance in place. But also just, I think the process of, or like the thought concept of bringing cultivation out of the hills into the valley where standard large scale agriculture comes into play is contentious for a number of reasons, but also, I think there is an aspect of cannabis and the uniqueness of cannabis, and certainly the medical cannabis world, is the nuance of small scale cultivation, the nuance of different, the plant being so adaptive to different environments that it's grown in, for different purposes. And I just, the history and the history of the communities and the local economies in some of these more not the Central Valley regions, especially in Northern California, it is worth working with. I know it's a very complex and like flawed process that it's been so far, but I don't think, yeah, I want to sort of push back on that, like bring
Yeah,
everybody out of the hills and the valley thing.
I think you're right to an extent. And like Nevada is a great example. You have corridors that are near a local area. Even though you're a rural county, it's a larger rural county, you're well resourced. And I think what's hard to imagine for people that maybe don't spend a lot of time in the state, like a Nevada County is very different than your neighbor Alpine, population 1,300, mostly federal land, or Sierra, 4,000 people, mostly federal land, Mono, 13,000 and some change, mostly federal land. So I think we have to look, there are communities where you may have some mountainous areas, but you have the tools and ability to have viable areas where you could do this. And you're by corridors and roads that make that possible. And there are some areas that are like really remote. If everyone has been to like Modoc and Alturas and some of these very rustic areas where you think, is this even a possibility given like there may be more cows than humans, and I mean that very seriously, of where do these communities make sense? They're on the North Coast where they had a tradition of doing this for a long time where it makes sense. And I think we get so caught up and everyone has to say yes all the time rather than where is it most appropriate and where do the communities embrace it, and where it fits into like their agricultural production and what they're doing. Like some counties are mainly ranching lands, right? And so I think we have to have those conversations of what makes sense, not just in cultivation, but I also think in retail as well. Because we get that a lot, like everywhere should have retail, and then no one's ever been to a county that has 0 incorporated cities, or like their largest cities like 500 people. Things just look different when you run the gamut of what all 58 counties look like. And that's why I think you have that local control piece, at least on opting, especially it's more complicated on the cultivation side than some of the other things.
And I do want to open it up for audience Q&A in a minute here. It's amazing how quickly time flies. This is a very interesting and rich discussion. So thank you. And I do really appreciate what both of you have shared. And could definitely talk a lot about this from our own research. But maybe one thing that I'll say is I agree, Maggie, with that point that you brought up that prohibition doesn't really stop an activity. That's something we've found consistently, as is obviously evidenced by the fact that there is so much unpermitted cultivation in places that have banned cultivation, right? And it does seem like there are a lot of examples of successes for counties that have allowed permitting, at least for those people, Sarah, like you mentioned, who want to enter the permitted market. And there are a lot of people in banned counties who would be interested in doing that. But there is a stickiness of place and poverty that we've found in our research where they're just cut out because that's where they are, and they maybe can't afford not only the very expensive and difficult process that, again, Sarah, you kind of outlined, but also moving to a new place, especially for those legacy cultivators and folks who have more limited resources. One question I want to ask maybe before opening it up to audience Q&A, and if anybody wants to put questions in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute, feel free to. But sort of building off of this, since Prop 64 and then the market crash more recently, how have you all seen cultivation practices change, or where cultivators are moving change? And just to give a little context, Michael and I are working right now with a number of other collaborators on our project, kind of looking at this dynamic of cultivators kind of coming out of the hills and now kind of going back up into the hills a little bit. And I'm just curious what you've seen in terms of the impact on cultivation practices and where people are cultivating, both after legalization and then also as a result of the market crash.
I'll take that one to start. One of the things that comes to mind, and I know this is not solely true for Nevada County, but I think any of the areas that prior to Prop 64 had really abundant cultivation communities in it. Most of the garden supply stores have gone out of business. I think it's been a very large impact to whole sector of the local economy, sort of like the trickle down impacts of the cannabis market crash has impacted probably every aspect of our local, I would say regional, local businesses and the economy in that sense. But I say that to say that in regards to farmers growing practices, people have gotten really lean and just like have really had to hone in on just like their business skills and really paying attention to how much the cost of production is and like how can they minimize any types of inputs, labor. I think people are doing a lot of the work themselves more. And that's true at many different stages through the growing season. And really just had to get really very attentive to bringing down their production costs and bringing down the cost per pound because the market is not kind right now to farmers, and there's you can get your price per pound of production down so much, but the market's still only offering less than that often these days. And so, but I think in some senses that has really encouraged people to get more keyed into things like soil health and regenerative practices that pay back year after year, and like as the more you do that in your farming practices, further down the line you really start to reap the benefits of a lot of those types of best management practices and regenerative practices.
This is one observation that I've made, and this is just specific to one county, but I feel like maybe it's possible in other places. San Luis Obispo County, we were working with an RCD that was so gung-ho and very excited about what was happening in the county when legalization first came aboard, that they were kind of the people that in a large part worked with us to deliver the Grass C program that I talked about. But since then, although regulated cannabis is still totally fine there are certain very loud voices in the community that are preventing any new farms basically from coming on board because they're concerned about the odor, or that's usually what they go after, to the point that there's no there haven't been any new small farmers that have even dared to get into it, because you go buy the land and you get all excited about it, and then these people come and shut you down because of the smell. So that's been a fascinating thing. I think so I'm wondering if even in a county that's ideal for growing, where it's legal, you have some very loud opponents who can make it even harder. So to me, that's such a shame, because there were a lot of farmers that were excited about doing good things there, and there's one left, as far as I know, of the small farmers that this RCD was working with.
I'll just add two things. One thing that I found interesting in Eula County from being a part of the permit process is this transition of outdoor to greenhouse. So we're seeing that. I would not be surprised if in the next 5 years, all of the operations are just greenhouses. Efficiency, potentially price on the market, and you eliminate you can control some of those odor issues. And so you eliminate some of the possible barriers in your permitting process or other expensive mitigations you have to do to meet your conditions of your use permit. So I think that's pretty interesting. One thing that I'm looking closely, and this is kind of from the perspective of cannabis, but something larger, is it's not easy to be a farmer in California, whatever crop you're doing. And we're seeing the death of small farms across the country, and the small family farm dying, and profits really just shrinking. That's a larger concern, but very much this industry will be impacted by that, plus has additional barriers. And we've already seen the industry shrink significantly from those that tried to get in originally in 2018 to where we are today. And how do we sustain the operators we have today so they're around and kind of weather this storm? And what kind of resources do we need to see to allow that to happen? And I think you got to be scrappy, and you have to have a business mind. And I don't really know how many people entering the market originally when it opened up are really prepared to what it was going to be like to essentially run an ag operation in California, which is complicated, a lot of red tape, a lot of money, and a lot of rules. And that's an added challenge. And so it's a bit of a struggle, and that alone can put someone out just because of a lot of financial, and they have no real access to some of those traditional loan functions.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. Diana, you've had your hand up for a while. I want to invite you, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, or feel free to type in the chat. And then I know Michael has a question. We can take that after Diana's. I think you're muted still.
Okay, hi everyone, Diana here. My question is AB 8, which is a bill that would allow, is proposed to allow the incorporation of intoxicating hemp into the cannabis supply chain. We believe that if that were to happen, that would significantly impact cultivation, counties that allow for cultivation. And so my question is, and conversations that we're having is what that would actually look like in terms of tax revenue to these jurisdictions and the impact of some of the tax revenue. And so I guess my question, Sarah, to you is, as you're working with different jurisdictions, specifically the rural jurisdictions that have cannabis production, and of course, we really are most focused on some of the legacy cannabis producing regions. How have those conversations been about AB 8 and the potential impacts on tax revenue related to displacement of cannabis farmers?
It's an interesting conversation because there's kind of two components going on. One around CBD and the lack of CBD production and the interest in incorporating CBD from hemp into some of the manufactured products to essentially lower the price point for consumers. And I think there's that then concern about what do you do with THC, and you have the synthetic, and then you have what's naturally taken out of hemp, that's THC. You kind of have to have a lot of hemp to even kind of have low dose THC products. And I think one of the biggest questions is how do we make sure a lot of these synthetics are out of the market? And I think that's a really important component of the bill. We have CDPH in some capacity trying to regulate, but frankly, it's not working. They're not regulating it. And so we have to do something to make sure this product is legal. So there's that. I think the THC component is the trickier component. And where the small cultivators are is not necessarily, I think, where the retailers would be or where the manufacturers would be. And really the manufacturers are operating in a lot of states that have both cannabis, hemp, sometimes just hemp. So it really becomes a bit of a complicated mess. I do think it is here. It's already happening. It's not going away. So how do we get our hands around regulating it today? Also potentially bringing in tax revenues. We know that the taxes are not even bringing in enough money to fill the buckets they were supposed to fill that go out to a lot of different community groups. And a lot of those people circle because they want a piece of the pie. They were promised a piece of the pie. I think it was an unrealistic promise that we need to sort out in 2028. And so that's the component too. Well, if they're selling these products, they should be taxed like cannabis. So I think there's still some things to be worked out. And I hear that there are amendments coming to hopefully address some of the issues of the small cultivators and the small farmers. But I do think ultimately what we've seen in other states is that hemp and cannabis are going to be under the same umbrella. And I think the question is, to what extent do we allow THC incorporated into the California market from out-of-state products? And I think those are the devils in the details being worked out. But what I can say today is hemp THC products is already undercutting the market. So we got to find a way to at least rein that back. And ultimately, I think it's important for our cannabis community to prepare, because when the walls of prohibition are lifted, you're competing with 49 other states. And the market in California may look smaller. And I think it's important to realize that, and also look at other streams like cannabis tourism, which I think is a viable option of that farm to fork mentality of California, but expanding it to other products. But it's a tough business to be a farmer, and even tougher if you decide you're going to be a farmer and farm cannabis.
Thanks for that. Yeah, tough messages to bring back to our 180 small farmers here in Nevada County, but working on it.
And there is progress. So I do know, I think it's Origins Council's been in a lot of those conversations. I expect amendments. And I think, at least from a county perspective, you have the cannabis market, but public health. But I think that DCC is better suited to do some type of regulatory authority over hemp than CDPH.
Thanks. Michael, do you want to ask your questions?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, it's a bit of a long one in there, but I'll just kind of abbreviate it here. And my mind's kind of in it because I'm writing up a case study out in Nevada County. So thank you, Maggie and Diana, for your time and helping me understand the case there a bit more. But one of the things that really comes through in that research, and actually in a number of case studies we're doing around the state, and that we're expecting probably some confirmation with the Canavision mapping tool that the State Water Board has developed, is that in the last couple of years, actually, there's been what ethnographically and qualitatively we know that it's actually hard to find more unlicensed cultivation these days. Perhaps it's still happening at an equal or larger scale, though I doubt it. But certainly the amount of people involved in it has declined pretty significantly. It's an uneven map across the state. And Margiana and I spent time in Siskiyou and San Bernardino, for instance, that have had quite big booms in the last couple of years, both of which I'll note are ban counties. So I would draw some kind of question and push back, Sarah, about the idea that licensing pathways don't make any difference when two of the biggest kind of growth patterns are actually in ban counties in this state. And there's other examples to kind of throw back. I mean, Napa actually has seen a big decline. In my mind, it kind of comes back to property values rather than to any kind of like actual policy, which is a little bit depressing because all these counties are really racking their brains to think about, well, what is the answer? What's the solution? And I think you're right in the sense that it's just an uneven conditions. And so each county kind of needs to figure out the solution that's going to come. So sorry, I don't mean to comment so much, but to get to the question, I guess I'm curious what you're seeing in YOLO or in your other kind of like observations to suggest that unlicensed cultivation is actually even expanding or maybe even more. And then the second part to that question, and I'm really sorry because I'm gonna have to ask this and then I'm gonna listen to the recording later. But is that the challenge then is, okay, so then how do you deal? It seems like the market has actually been quite successful. The last couple of years of market downturn has meant that a lot of people in our observations so far have really dropped out because it's not profitable anymore. And so how do you then balance the need to have a healthy market and well-supported prices with the fact that then unlicensed cultivators then come back into the mix? And then if you enforce against them, then then how does that square with state and voter goals of enhancing social equity and ending the criminalization of cannabis? And these are the kind of grand paradoxes I think that we're all stuck in, how to support a healthy market and how to deal with the question of enforcement.
I think you're right that the boom has to do with cheap property, frankly. And what I've seen, especially talking with CDFW and their enforcement people, it used to be primarily on public lands. That's swapped. So most of the illegal cultivation is on private land, and it's cheap land. And they're going to dump the land, and we're going to be responsible for cleaning it up. And it costs a lot of money, and it may or may not be cleaned up. So I think there's definitely a correlation on where can you go where you're going to have very little eyes, very little law enforcement, and buy really cheap land and get some water source.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the driver. San Bernardino is probably more groundwater. Northern California, it's probably a mix, but a lot of probably surface water diversions. So I think that's kind of where you see a lot of the growth. That was a lot of questions. I'm trying to think what other portions of the question you had. Enforcement, I think, has been a challenge because essentially DAs only bite if it's egregious environmental crimes. So what do you do with the people that are really smart and maybe have a legal well, are going to do that and grow illegally? And that's where we have looked at code enforcement and some other like enhanced mechanisms to compel compliance or be able to recover administrative fines or penalty or recover the cleanup costs associated with these parcels. And frankly, what do we do with the parcels once they're abandoned? Which there is a process, and it's a long process, Chapter 8 and Chapter 7 tax sales. What do you do with like we have Lake County has over 1,000 abandoned piece of property that the county is trying to figure out how the heck do we offload this? So there's a lot of other associated issues. And I think we've changed how we enforce. Like we don't want to throw everyone in jail, but I think what we have discovered is there are still egregious behavior that probably should have more consequences and are within the scope of 64 that we have to adjust. Like we've worked on some legislation that hasn't gone super far around how do you incorporate some of the groundwater water theft now that we're in this SGMA realm, and what do those penalties look like? Because it may not be surface water, but you may be having huge impacts on your neighbors. Or what do we do with whack-a-mole? So you can take the guns, you can take the money, and you can take the plants, but you can't take any of the infrastructure. And so they move the infrastructure, or this is a really common story in some of our legal counties. It's the legal cannabis folks telling the county do something about the illegal cannabis folks, and they call us 48 hours later. Once all the plants are removed, plants are back in the ground. So that kind of like whack-a-mole. And so that's really challenging. And frankly, I do think that the illegal cannabis operations will get better once the feds stop prohibition. Because there's a market, right? The only reason you're doing this and you're growing at this scale is there's a market. It's just not a market in California. And it's probably in a market where there's not a legal state. And I do think there's work to be done in terms of access. I think that's the biggest issue. I think we grow a lot of cannabis. I think we grow more than enough, probably based on the farms today, to provide cannabis to California, but the retail hasn't quite had some pace in catching up. Part of that, I think, is a huge block in Southern California in incorporated cities. And how do you get there has been a real challenge, and that feeds. And so you see the illegal retailers, and that feeds some of the activity, right? Product goes from north to south. Some of the products actually not ours. It's illegal product from Oregon. Getting to Southern California. And I think one part we never think about is the consumer. It's still a fairly new consumer that's going to a retail market. And I don't think we've done a really good job of helping them know what's legal and what's not, because there's some places that look pretty legit and they are not legit. Same with the hemp product coming in. And also, we tend to be a very environmentally conscious state, and there hasn't been a good nexus of what does it mean if I buy this illegal cannabis, right? What does this mean? And I think when you put in some of the egregious activities and you're doing a better campaign of being like, this is the reason you buy, legal product, maybe there'll be more change, but I don't know if the consumers have really caught up on that portion of it. Because especially if you've ever seen some of these pop-ups in Southern California, and that's also whack-a-mole. That are Southern California jurisdictions. And then you get the cities that are like, oh, well, this is happening, so I don't want to see it in my neck of the woods. And I will say there's probably a nexus between some of the community issues we see, whether with affordable housing projects. So this type of mentality is not new. It's just extended to cannabis. And how do you move past that, especially in urban areas? I don't know if I got all parts of your question, but
it was a lot. I mean, I find this really interesting. I would love to, obviously have a discussion. I think this is really great. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, super interesting. And thank you both. And Nancy, you had to hop off for taking the time to talk to us. I just want to see if there are any concluding thoughts that you want to add to the conversation, any kind of like overarching lessons learned. I know, Sarah, you mentioned like the loss of family farmers across, not just in cannabis, but all kinds of agricultural production. That was a comment that stuck out to me. Just lessons that we might take away from this conversation or from the work that you all are doing.
Yeah, I mean, that comment about small farms across the country being lost, I mean, has been true for my entire adult life, unfortunately, but it breaks my heart to hear you say that so strongly again right now. And I think I mean, like, cannabis or otherwise, I think that is a major loss for our country. For California, we are one of the biggest agricultural producers in the world. I think that small farms are the future. I will forever believe that. And I also just, in addition to that, I just want to say that I think that any form of prohibition, whether it's on a local jurisdiction level or otherwise, on the federal, hurts the ability for there to be a thriving, functioning legal industry. And I think that there is benefit to the legal industry that is so fragile right now, and that we're all trying to sort of keep adding band-aids to try to make it stay alive in any capacity. I think that every opportunity to continue to decrease stigma and to end prohibition just across the board helps that industry stay alive or to exist in any capacity. And it's not to say that everybody has to start participating in the industry or anything like that, but I think that just the mindset of prohibition will always lead to there still being a prohibited, like, illegal market. And so if the goal is to get away from that, I think that, I just think we really need to support the people who have made it this far. And, we've come so far that it's filtered out so many bad actors along the way in every regard. And I think that there's so much regulatory and policy stuff that is run-of-the-mill problematic, but I just pro small farms, and, we've got to keep destigmatizing and getting rid of like prohibitionist mindsets. The regulations are built out of are prohibitionary in and of themselves. And I think that continuing to focus on those things as we all move forward in this, and the massive education piece.
And one question I ask myself all the time, did California do it right? And I don't think I've ever gotten to yes. It's an interesting concept because even the prohibition model is not uniform based on states. Like, a lot of different states have taken different approaches, but they were very lucky that they were some of the first few, and some have revamped it. We have a very interesting model because we had a legislature trying to do it, and then we have an initiative, which makes it incredibly hard to change certain things. So, like, is California the right model? Is this model the one that should be around? Do we need to take it back to the voters? I think it will be interesting to see how cannabis policy develops in California and if some of those major change happens depending on dynamics. But I think the California model is very interesting because we went first. Our local governments look different than local governments in a different part of the country. But I often ask myself, did we do it right? Are other states doing it better? Definitely.
Well, on that note, I think we should wrap up our conversation here. I know, Peng, we have a slide or two just to share in closing out, but I want to say thank you again, Sarah and Maggie and Nancy, who had to hop off, for taking the time to talk with us today and sharing your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. This was great.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks Margiana and panelists for having this really productive conversation. I think my ending remarks, links are in the chat, but if you want to follow our monthly newsletter, we'd appreciate it. You can follow, I mean, we usually have our events, recent publications, other kind of community research spotlights and highlights as well. And so the link is in the chat. QR codes are on the screen. And otherwise, thank you so much for spending your Friday afternoon with us. Thank you.
Thanks,
And I will
everyone.
keep this up for the next minute.